If you are new here, welcome to Lotus Tale Studios, where we bring you stories of wit, resilience, and women who refuse to be broken. Hit that subscribe button and the bell so you never miss a tale. We put out new stories every week, and trust me, you do not want to miss what is coming. Now settle in, because this one is long, layered, and worth every single minute. I was going to be the future crown princess. That was not a boast. It was simply fact, written into an imperial decree and sealed with the emperor's own mark. My name was Wei Mingju, the last daughter of House Wei, a house that had given the empire its finest generals and paid for that loyalty in blood. Then a woman stopped my carriage in the middle of the street. She stepped out from the crowd on a bright afternoon, dressed in plain southern cotton, her hair pinned simply, her face pretty in the way that made men stop walking. She raised her hand and my driver pulled the horses to a halt. Before I could ask what she wanted, she produced a piece of white jade carved with a dragon coiled around a sword. I recognized it immediately. It was Crown Prince Shen Liangyi's personal seal, the one he wore at his waist every single day. She held it up with a lift of her chin and said, clear as a bell, that the Crown Prince was already her husband. That they had wed in a riverside village in the south over a year ago. That she had walked 1,000 miles to find him and she would not be ignored. Her name was Xiaoa, and she had no idea who I was. What she also did not know was that my betrothal to the Crown Prince was not a love match. It was never meant to be. The emperor had arranged this marriage as a public demonstration of his gratitude to House Wei. My father and my elder brother had died at Qingshan Pass holding back an enemy force 3 times their size. They never retreated. They never surrendered. They held that pass until their last breath, and the empire survived because of it. When the news reached the capital, the emperor, in his grief and his guilt, bestowed upon me the highest honor available to a woman of the noble class. The title of Crown Princess was his way of telling the world he remembered what my family had sacrificed. It was a monument, not a marriage. And so the position Xiaoa coveted so desperately was not one the Crown Prince had any power to give her. That decision had been made by the emperor himself. I looked at the jade pendant in her hand. I looked at her face. And I told my driver to move on. But I brought her with me. I had decided, in that brief moment on the street, that it would be foolish to leave her wandering the capital alone. A woman carrying the Crown Prince's seal and a marriage claim was a blade that could cut in any direction. Better to keep her close and within my sight than to let her run loose where anyone with ambition could pick her up and point her like an arrow. The Crown Prince looked stunned when he saw me arrive at the eastern courtyard. But his eyes found Xiaoa a heartbeat later, and the color left his face entirely. She had been standing quietly behind me. The moment she saw him, that quiet dissolved. She darted around me, crossed the courtyard in a few quick steps, and threw herself into his arms, her hands gripping his robes, her voice dropping to a trembling murmur. "My husband," she said. "I found you." Every attendant, every maid, every guard in that courtyard went utterly still. And every eye slowly turned to me. I raised my handkerchief to my lips. I coughed, twice, softly. It was the kind of sound that reminded a room that someone of consequence was present, without requiring me to raise my voice. The prince pulled himself together and looked down at her. His expression was a war between guilt, tenderness, and panic all fighting for the same piece of ground. "Xiaoa," he said carefully. "How did you get here? I never told you to come to the capital." She lifted her face to his, her eyes full of tears, her lips pressed together in the particular way that made her look unbearably fragile. "You told me you were going to the capital to find your relatives," she whispered. "You said you would return within the month. That was over a year ago. I waited and waited. I asked everywhere. Everyone I spoke to told me the Crown Prince was to be married soon, that a Crown Princess would preside over the Eastern Palace." She paused, letting the tears finally spill over. "So then what am I? What does that make me?" The prince reached up and gently wiped her cheeks. Around us, the attendants were doing their absolute best to look at the walls, the ground, the sky, anywhere but at me. "Now that you are here," he said softly, "you will stay. We will sort the rest out later." Xiaoa was clever. She heard the word stay and she did not push for more. She lowered her head, accepted the comfort, and let a maid lead her toward the rear courtyard. But as she passed me, she glanced sideways, and in that glance I saw it clearly. Defiance. Calculation. And the faintest curl of a smile. This woman was far from simple. The Crown Prince and I were left standing in the courtyard together. The silence between us was thick enough to cut. I did not wait for him to speak first. I turned and walked back through the gates. There was nothing useful to be said in that moment, and I had never been fond of wasting words. News travels fast in a capital city, and bad news travels faster than anything. Within 2 days, every tea house and silk shop in the city was buzzing with the story. The Crown Prince, they said, had secretly married a fisherman's daughter from the south. A girl who had pulled him from a river when assassins tried to drown him during a royal tour. He had married her in her village before anyone could stop him. And now his officially betrothed, the last daughter of the great Wei family, had been left in an impossible position. My family name became a joke overnight. The noble house of Wei, they whispered. No sons left, no power left, and now no future either. My engagement to the prince was the latest entertainment for the capital's gossips, and I was the punchline. Everywhere I went I was met with strange pitying stares, so I refused all invitations and remained within the walls of our manor. I was not hiding. I was watching. When the prince finally came to see me, I was trimming an orchid in the courtyard. He walked in quickly, with the air of a man who had rehearsed what he was about to say and was eager to deliver it before his confidence ran out. Mingju, he said. You will still be the crown princess. That has not changed. Xiaoa will be recorded in the royal family records as my consort. It is the most I can offer her without overstepping the emperor's decree. This is the arrangement I have decided upon, and I believe it is a fair one. He said it the way someone says a thing when they believe they are being extraordinarily generous. I kept my eyes on the orchid. And is Miss Yun content with the title of consort? I asked pleasantly. It is quite a step down from wife. His brow tightened. Xiaoa is not the kind of woman who chases status. Her heart is pure. She cares only for me, not for rank or position. That last part landed with the weight of an implied comparison. He was telling me, without quite saying it, that she was better than me because she did not want what I was supposedly clinging to. How admirable, I said, setting down my shears. A woman of such noble character truly deserves a man worthy of her. What a pity. I let the silence after that do its work. He understood the jab. His jaw tightened. You have always been sharp-tongued. I came here to settle things between us, not to trade barbs. Xiaoa is gentle and she will not cause you trouble if you do not cause her any. But I am warning you now, Mingju. I will not tolerate schemes or cruelty from the women's quarters. If you cannot behave with grace, the Eastern Palace will know nothing but conflict. Then it is fortunate, I said, folding my hands neatly, that I am so very willful and difficult. I imagine I will disappoint you both quite terribly. He left in a storm of rustling robes, and I returned to my orchid. Our manor was quiet in the way that only houses that have lost people can be quiet. The absence of my father and brother lived in every room. What remained of House Wei was my grandmother, Lady Kui Shuiying, and myself. We were two women holding up the name of a family that had once commanded armies. My grandmother had sharp eyes and a sharper mind, and she had taught me everything she knew about surviving in a world that would rather you did not. The emperor's arrangement had been made to honor the dead. The Empress Dowager, however, had other ideas entirely. She had never been pleased with this match. House Wei was declining. We had no political allies to offer, no military strength left, no sons to continue the line. From where she stood, the Crown Prince's future would be better secured by a bride from a family with something real to contribute. My appointment as Crown Princess tied up the Eastern Palace without giving the imperial family anything useful in return, and the Empress resented it quietly and thoroughly. She recognized in Xiaoa an opportunity. The girl was charming, adaptable, and deeply attached to the prince. More importantly, she was malleable. The Empress began cultivating her, inviting her to banquets, gifting her fine robes, praising her warmth and her manners in front of the assembled court ladies. She was building the girl into a weapon and pointing that weapon directly at me, while keeping her own hands entirely clean. On the night of the Lantern Festival, I sat alone in a decorated barge on the river and watched the Crown Prince escort Xiaoa through the festivities on the bank. He won her prizes at the market stalls. He bought her candied fruit and laughed when the syrup got on her fingers. They stood together in the middle of the bustling street, a handsome couple lit by 100 lanterns, their eyes full of warmth, drawing admiring looks from the crowd who did not know who they were. People pointed at them the way people point at things that are beautiful and uncomplicated. I poured myself another cup of wine and drank it. The prince had long resented this marriage the emperor had arranged for him. His behavior tonight was not accidental. He knew I would hear about it. He may have even known I was there. This was a deliberate and public message dressed up as a romantic evening. I set down the cup, stepped off the barge, and walked up the stone steps to the riverbank. I moved at a calm and unhurried pace until I was standing not far from where they stood. Close enough that the lantern light reached me. Close enough to be seen. The smiles on their faces vanished the moment they noticed me. It was as though a cold wind had moved through the warm evening. The prince wrapped an arm around Xiaoa's shoulders and turned her away, steering her down the street without acknowledging me. As if I were a stranger. As if I were nothing at all. I watched them go. Then I took a lantern from my maid Lian, walked down to the riverbank, and knelt on the bottom step. I set the lantern gently on the surface of the water and watched it catch the current and drift out into the dark, joining the dozens of other small lights floating downstream. Lian stood behind me, quietly furious on my behalf. "My lady," she said, her voice low and tight, "you should not have to endure this. You are not yet even married and already he behaves so openly. Once you are in that palace, he will favor her in everything. She will walk all over you. Everyone can see it." I rose slowly, brushing the dust from my knees, my eyes following the lantern until it became just another small light among many. "How long can royal affection last?" I said quietly, "if it is built only on feeling? If that is all she has to stand on, she is not yet a rival worth worrying about." My maid fell silent. She had heard me. But I was not sure she had understood. When I returned to the manor, my grandmother was waiting for me in her chambers, her prayer beads moving slowly through her fingers, her eyes closed. She opened them when I came in and looked at me with the steady attention she had always given me, the kind that saw past whatever expression I was wearing. "Was the festival lively?" she asked. "Did you enjoy yourself?" "The lights were brilliant," I said. "Very festive." She nodded slowly. "It is good that you can remain composed," she said, her voice gentle. "Life is not won or lost in a single night. The man who thinks he has humiliated you tonight has simply shown you more of his character. Store it away. Every piece of what a person shows you is useful eventually." I sat beside her and took her hand. I already knew this. She had taught it to me years ago, on the day the news came from Qingshan Pass and we sat together in this same room and held each other while the world outside did not stop moving for even a moment. I told her I understood. She patted my hand and closed her eyes again, her prayer beads resuming their quiet rhythm. Xiaoa was taken to the Eastern Palace not long after, where the senior ladies-in-waiting began teaching her court etiquette. The Empress was investing in her seriously now, teaching the girl how to walk, how to speak, how to arrange her sleeves and lower her eyes at the right moments. Word reached me that Xiaoa was a fast learner. Her tutors praised her memory and her manners. The Empress herself was reportedly pleased with the girl's progress and had begun bringing her to smaller court gatherings, letting her presence become familiar before any formal arrangements were settled. Clearly, the Empress had chosen her side, and it was not mine. The invitation to the Empress's flower-viewing banquet arrived at our gate on a quiet morning. I could not refuse it. Refusing would have looked like weakness, or worse, like fear. I dressed carefully and went. When I arrived, Xiaoa was already standing at the Empress's right side, close enough that their sleeves nearly touched. The Empress waited until the main group of ladies had assembled and then, with a timing that was entirely theatrical, plucked a large peony from the arrangement beside her and placed it into Xiaoa's hands. She announced to the room that here was a woman of true gentleness and grace, the kind of calm and warm presence that would bring peace and harmony to the Eastern Palace. She added that she felt at ease knowing such a person would be at the prince's side. The surrounding ladies echoed her praise in the way court ladies always echo whatever the Empress says, each one stealing careful glances at me to measure whether the arrow had found its mark. Xiaoa smiled. She looked across the garden to where I stood, and her smile changed in a way that would not have been visible to anyone who was not paying close attention. It sharpened, just slightly, the way a blade catches light when it turns. The Empress was publicly acknowledging her, sending me a clear and deliberate warning. I had no interest in standing in that circle, performing the expected expressions. I excused myself with perfect courtesy and slipped away down a side corridor, finding a small pavilion at the far end of the garden that overlooked a fish pond. I sat down, watched the water, and let the noise of the banquet fade behind the sound of wind in the bamboo. She followed me. I heard her footsteps on the stone path and did not turn around. She sat down across from me without being invited, arranged her skirts, and looked at me with the satisfaction of someone who has recently been told she is winning. "Do you see how things stand now, Lady Wei?" she said. "This is what your life will look like if you enter the Eastern Palace. The Empress has made her preference clear. The Prince has made his feelings plain. Is it really worth all of this?" I had allowed her earlier provocations to pass. She had earned a certain number of them. But what she said next was a step across a line that should not have existed. "Of course," she continued, her voice taking on a sharper and crueler edge, "how could I ever compare to the great Lady Wei Mingju? Your father and brother paid for your position with their lives, after all. Tell me, when you lie awake at night, does your heart not ache with the weight of that?" My hand moved before I had fully decided to move it. The sound of the slap was crisp and clean in the quiet pavilion. She gasped and her hand flew to her face, her eyes going wide with a shock she had clearly not prepared for. I stood. I crossed the space between us, took her by the throat, and pressed her back against the stone pillar behind her. Not hard enough to do real harm. Hard enough to make every word I was about to say arrive with its full weight. "My father and my brother gave their lives for this empire," I said. My voice was quiet and very even. "Their sacrifice is not something you have the right to speak of. Not to make a point in an argument. Not ever. The title you want so badly is worth nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to the ground that holds their bones." Panic had replaced the satisfaction in her eyes entirely. She had grown comfortable in the shelter of the Empress's favor and had begun to believe that shelter made her untouchable. She had not expected me to reach through it. House Wei was a family of generals. My father and brother were warriors. I may be a woman unable to ride into battle, but I am not without weapons. "You are going to want to scream for help right now," I added, watching her face. "I would think carefully before you do. You have had your moment in the spotlight today. If you make this into something larger, you will lose more than you gain." I released her. She pressed herself against the pillar and said nothing. I straightened my sleeves and walked back toward the banquet. On the ride home, my maid Lian was upset, which with her always expressed itself as a torrent of words delivered at considerable volume. "The royal family was ungrateful," she said. "The Wei men had bled for an empire that was now allowing their last surviving daughter to be publicly humiliated. It was shameful and cruel, and it made her furious just thinking about it. And why did my lady always remain so calm? Did it not hurt? Did she not want to fight back louder and more openly, in a way the whole court could see?" I patted her hand and let her talk. What I did not tell Lian was something I had been quietly noticing for several weeks. Her questions were always pointed in a particular direction. Her suggestions always nudged me toward public conflict, toward dramatic gestures that would isolate me and make me look erratic and unstable. She encouraged me to act rashly, to fight loudly, to make scenes at the wrong moments. And every time I held back and observed quietly, she pushed me to do the opposite. Someone was steering her. And through her, trying to steer me. I had not yet decided what to do about it. But I was watching very carefully. When we arrived home, a letter was waiting. It was from one of my father's former subordinates, a man who had served under him at Qingshan Pass and survived by chance and circumstance. He wrote only that he was in the capital, that he had heard things, and that if I ever needed anything I had only to send word. I read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and placed it inside my writing box. I was out of the capital for 10 days visiting one of our northern estates when everything came apart at once. I returned to find that two things had happened in my absence. The Crown Prince had submitted a petition to the Emperor requesting that the royal wedding be postponed by 2 years, framed as a necessary military inspection tour to the northern border. It was a transparent attempt to string me along indefinitely, and everyone in the capital understood exactly what it was. And Xiaoa had come to our manor while I was gone. Whatever she had said to my grandmother, it had been vicious enough to send Lady Kui to her bed. A servant met me at the city gates with the news, and I rode back without stopping. When I arrived, I found my grandmother lying pale and still against her pillows, her breathing thin, her face drawn with anger and shock. I walked back out through the front gate. Xiaoa was just leaving the street outside, her steps light, her chin high, wearing the expression of a woman who has done something she considers a victory. She saw me and slowed. She looked at me the way people look at something they have already decided is no longer a threat. "Your father and your brother are gone," she said. Her voice was pleasant, almost conversational. House Wei is an empty name on a fading gate. Once you are married off and shut away in the Eastern Palace, what is left here? One old woman rattling around a house that nobody visits anymore. The Empress despises you. The prince has made his feelings plain. Why are you still holding on to this? What exactly are you fighting for? The gate behind us was open. The street beyond it was full of the ordinary afternoon noise of the capital. Vendors calling out their wares. Servants running errands. Neighbors passing with no particular destination. They were slowing down now, the way people slow down when they sense something worth watching. My hands tightened at my sides. When I spoke, my voice cracked, and I let it crack, because this time the grief underneath it was entirely real and required no performance. "My father's bones," I said, and had to stop and breathe. "My father's bones are buried on a mountain that nobody visits. My brother died before he was old enough to have a family of his own. My grandmother and I are what is left of everything they loved and protected." I stopped again. Tears were falling now and I made no move to stop them. Around us, the street had gone very quiet. "If you want this title so desperately, then take it. It seems the Crown Prince and the Empress have already decided that what House Wei gave to this empire means nothing at all." I had turned the direction of the blame precisely where it needed to land. Not on Xiaoa, who was just a tool, but on the two people who had been moving her carefully from the shadows while keeping their own reputations clean. By naming them, by weeping in public, by invoking my father and brother in front of witnesses on a busy street, I had just placed the imperial family on the wrong side of a story that would now travel in every direction the capital wind blew. The crowd murmured. I heard fragments drifting toward me. The men of House Wei died holding Qingshan Pass, and this is how the palace treats what they left behind. If they wanted to break the engagement, they should have done it with dignity, not sent this village woman to terrorize an old widow. She is only this bold because she has powerful people standing behind her. The Empress, they say. The Empress is the one pulling the strings. Xiaoa had not expected the street to become a stage. She had come to wound me quietly and leave before anyone noticed. Now there was a growing crowd of ordinary citizens staring at her, and not one of them was on her side. She turned and walked away, her steps just a fraction too quick to be dignified. I watched her go. Gossip could be a blade that cuts you, but it could also be a sword in your own hand. Today I had used it as both. By showing weakness I had placed them on the wrong side of public opinion. Today's drama was a trap I had set for her, and she had walked straight into it. I was not afraid of her causing a scene. I had been counting on it. I wiped my face and went back inside to my grandmother. I sent servants out before nightfall to find the most respected physicians in the capital. The news of Lady Kui's collapse spread through the noble houses by morning, and by afternoon the tone of the whispers in the city had shifted dramatically. This was no longer a story about a prince's village romance and a noble girl's embarrassment. This was a story about the imperial family persecuting a house full of women whose men had died serving the throne. Senior court officials submitted written memorials to the throne before the week was out. Several cited the crown prince's lack of private virtue and his failure to maintain order in his household. Elder statesmen wrote to the emperor directly, describing the mistreatment of a national hero's descendants as a chilling warning to every loyal subject in the empire. The word used in several memorials was disgraceful. The emperor had the crown prince reprimanded publicly in the throne room. It was the first time that had happened in memory. Imperial gifts began arriving at our gate. Bolts of the finest silk. Lacquered boxes of rare medicine. Baskets of preserved fruit and imported tea. And then the imperial physicians, following close behind with solemn faces and medicine bags, sent by the palace to attend to my grandmother personally. The crown prince came to the manor himself. He brought Xiaoa with him. Neither of them looked as though they wanted to be there, because they did not. This visit was not a gesture of goodwill. It was a command performance ordered from above, and the reluctance was visible in every step they took through our gate. Attendants followed them carrying lacquered boxes of medicinal herbs. The prince cleared his throat, asked after my grandmother's health in a formal voice, and was led to her chambers to pay his respects. Before he left, an attendant presented me with a brocade box on his behalf. Inside, resting on a bed of yellow silk, was a jade pendant carved with a luan bird in full flight. It was a piece crafted exclusively by the imperial artisans and given only to the official crown princess, a symbol of her supreme status. Every person in that courtyard understood what it signified. He stood before me and said, in a low and carefully controlled voice, that the wedding date had been set by the Ministry of Rites for the following month. That Xiaoa had agreed to accept the position of consort and would be recorded in the royal family records accordingly. That he expected both of us to maintain a harmonious household in the Eastern Palace going forward. Agreed to accept. As though the position had been hers to negotiate over from the beginning. I looked at the pendant in the box. Your Highness should hold on to this until after the ceremony, I said, and stepped back. Annoyance moved across his face, but he contained it. He went back to say a few more formal words to my grandmother and then departed, the great imperial carriage rolling out through our gate with considerably more fanfare than the visit had warranted. He had made the whole thing as visible as possible. He wanted the city to see him making peace. He thought the display would quiet the rumors. He thought this was over. It was not over. It was only beginning. Xiaoa had lingered in our courtyard while he was inside. She stood near the pond, her posture carefully submissive for the benefit of anyone watching, but when I came to stand nearby I could see the defiance still burning underneath. She had been through a difficult few weeks. The Empress's most trusted senior matron had been assigned to the Eastern Palace to put her through intensive court training, and that training had not been gentle. Her face was pale and her eyes had a distant quality that had not been there before. But it was not enough. I had one more thing to give her. You look very much like someone, I said, keeping my voice conversational. She looked at me warily. What do you mean? The wife of the Minister of Justice, I said. Lady Jiang Ruolan. The resemblance is quite striking. The color left her face. She stared at me with the wide, panicked eyes of someone who has just heard the floor crack beneath them. What are you saying? She whispered. I said it again, calmly. That she and Lady Jiang bore a remarkable resemblance. That the crown prince, when he looked at her, might be seeing someone else entirely. Someone he had loved before she ever existed in his world. Someone he had lost to a marriage arranged by the Empress years before he ever traveled south. You can see for yourself if you doubt me, I said. Look at Lady Jiang's face. Then look at the portrait that has been kept in the locked cabinet in the Eastern Palace Library. You will find your answer. The date on the scroll will tell you everything you need to know. I had come across that portrait 3 years ago, wandering into the library by accident during a formal visit to the palace. I had stood in front of it for a long time, looking at the face, understanding what I was seeing. And when Xiaoa had stopped my carriage that bright afternoon and I had seen her face clearly for the first time, I had known immediately why the crown prince had married her in a riverside village without a second thought. She was a ghost of someone he could never have, and he had reached out and grabbed her without fully understanding why. Xiaoa stood completely still in our courtyard after I finished speaking, drained white, her eyes fixed on some point that was not the present moment. When the prince appeared and came to collect her, she walked beside him mechanically. She climbed into the imperial carriage like a woman moving through water. The carriage rolled away, all imperial fanfare and gleaming lacquer, carrying two people who were both, in very different ways, completely lost. I watched it disappear through the gate. Then I went inside to sit with my grandmother. Lady Kui was propped against her pillows, her prayer beads moving slowly. When I came in, she opened her eyes and looked at me with the quiet attention that always meant she had been thinking carefully. "You handled this well," she said. "You taught me," I replied. "When I was young, you told me that even if House Wei was left with only women, we must never allow ourselves to be walked over. I have always remembered." She was quiet for a moment. "The servant who came to find you at the city gates," she said carefully. "I may have timed that rather deliberately." I smiled. "I know. I guessed your plan and played my part." She reached out and took my hand. Her grip was still strong. "There is little more this old woman can do for you," she said quietly. "But the prince is not a good man." "I know," I said. "Which is why this game is not over." She seemed to understand my meaning and said nothing more. Outside, the city buzzed with the aftermath of everything that had happened. But inside this room, with the lamplight steady and the prayer beads warm in her hand, it was very still. There was one more piece of this I had not yet addressed. Lian. I had been watching her for weeks, tracking the pattern of her questions, her suggestions, her small persistent nudges toward self-destruction. I had let her continue because a known channel of information flowing in the wrong direction is still a channel, and channels can be used in both directions. But the time for that was ending. One evening, when the courtyard was quiet and the other servants were occupied inside, I found her by the garden wall and told her plainly that I knew. I told her I despised disloyalty but that I had tolerated hers for a reason, and that the reason was now coming to its conclusion. I told her she had a choice. She could take me to her master willingly, or she could wait until she had no choices left. She fell to her knees. She was frightened enough to be honest. 3 days later, blindfolded in a carriage that took me outside the city walls, I was led through a maze of corridors into a private residence and brought to stand before a man I had already expected to find. Prince Jingha, the emperor's second son. He was dressed in black robes edged with silver, seated on a raised platform, carrying himself with the careful ease of someone who has spent years watching other people underestimate him. He was handsome in a controlled and deliberate way. Every part of him was arranged, like a room that has been prepared for a guest it has been waiting for. He told me Lian had reported my intelligence. He said he had not expected me to find him this quickly. There was genuine surprise underneath the composed exterior. I told him I had not only found him but had mapped out the full shape of his design from beginning to end. He had located Xiaoa deliberately, I said. He had searched the south for a woman who resembled Lady Jiang Ruolan, the wife of the Minister of Justice, the woman the Crown Prince had loved as a young man and lost to a marriage the Empress had arranged to prevent any other possibility. The Crown Prince had never recovered from that loss. When he went south and met Xiaoa by the river, he had seen the ghost of the woman he had given up on, and he had married her in a village without thinking clearly about what he was actually reaching for. Prince Jingha had found Xiaoa and cultivated her ambition through a carefully placed companion, a woman named Fang Mai who attached herself to Xiaoa under the guise of friendship and gradually steered her north toward the capital and toward a collision that would destabilize the Eastern Palace and the Empress's carefully maintained position. He had planted Lian near me for the same purpose. He had set us both in motion and watched the fire spread to the Empress, to the court, to the public, all of it exactly as he had designed. He was the invisible hand in the game from the very beginning. I told him I had no desire to end his game. I had come to join it. Not as one of his pieces, but as a partner who understood the full board. He studied me for a long moment with the measuring look of a man recalibrating everything he has assumed about a situation. The dismissive ease he had walked in with was entirely gone. "You want my help," he said. "Your Highness is mistaken," I replied evenly. "It is I who am offering to help you." Astonishment moved across his face, unguarded and genuine. He had offered what the world would consider an extraordinary position and I was turning it around entirely. "What is it that you want in return?" he asked. I told him I would name my price when the time came. But I told him what I brought to the table was something he did not have and could not manufacture on his own. He agreed, and we parted. I returned to the manor and said nothing to anyone about where I had been. By nightfall, a new version of the day's story was moving through the capital's tea houses. Now the whispers said that the Crown Prince's visit to House Wei had been a calculated performance, that he had brought Xiaoa intentionally not to make peace but to deliver one final humiliation, and that my grandmother's worsening condition was a direct result of the imperial family's sustained cruelty toward a defenseless house with no one left to stand up for it. My grandmother dressed herself in her full ceremonial robes, the ones she had not worn since my father's funeral, and went to the palace. She knelt at the base of the marble steps before the Hall of Supreme Harmony. She announced in a voice that carried further than it should have been able to that House Wei was of humble and diminished circumstance, wholly unworthy of a royal alliance, and she begged the emperor to rescind his decree and release the crown prince to find a bride more suited to his needs and his station. I knelt behind her. The two of us, grandmother and granddaughter, bowed at the foot of those long white steps in full view of everyone who passed. Senior officials, imperial relatives, foreign envoys, palace servants carrying trays. They all saw us. Two women who were everything that remained of a family the empire had once depended on, asking for nothing except the dignity of being allowed to step aside on their own terms. Many of them stopped walking. Several bowed their heads. I heard more than once the soft sound of someone exhaling slowly, the sound that means grief and regret pressed together until they become something heavier than either one alone. The emperor issued his decree that same afternoon. The engagement was dissolved. He also bestowed upon House Wei a fortune in gold and a grant of fertile land across 3 provinces, which was as close as an emperor could come to an apology without ever actually offering one. By requesting the annulment ourselves, we had given him the perfect way to close a scandal that had grown too large to ignore. The Empress had wanted me to disappear quietly. Instead, the whole empire had witnessed her behavior and drawn its own conclusions. I helped my grandmother to her feet and we walked together through the long palace corridors. I looked up at the jade-green roof tiles and the red pillars and felt something loosen inside me that had been tight for a very long time. The wide world outside the palace was where one could truly breathe. In the carriage, my grandmother held my hand. "They wanted you to disappear quietly," she said after a long silence. "Yes," I said. "They wanted you to swallow your dignity and step aside with minimal fuss. To let them write the story however they liked." "Yes," I said. "And instead," she said, and there was something warm and proud moving through her voice now, "you made sure the entire empire will be talking about their behavior for the next 10 years. I leaned my head against her shoulder. Outside, the city moved past the carriage window in the amber light of late afternoon, entirely unaware that anything of consequence had just happened. But it had. And the effects of it were already moving outward in every direction, the way a stone moves water when it lands. The men of House Wei had fire in their blood. The women of our house were not made for silent submission. The emperor confined the crown prince to his residence and relieved him of all court duties for 6 months. His reputation, already damaged by months of public spectacle, did not recover from the censure. And then the portrait appeared. It happened during a late-night gathering at the Eastern Palace Library, when a guest who had drunk considerably more than was wise knocked over a candelabra. In the rush to save the books, their contents were moved out into the courtyard, and among them was a scroll. A painting of a woman, beautifully rendered, made with care and time and unmistakable feeling. A sharp-eyed courtier noticed the date on the scroll first. Then he noticed the face. Then he went away and thought about it carefully, and came back certain. The portrait was not of Xiaoa. It was painted years before the prince had ever traveled south. The woman in it was Lady Jiang Ruolan, the Minister of Justice's wife, who had grown up in the palace as a childhood companion to the prince and had been swiftly married to the minister by the Empress's arrangement before any other possibility could be explored. The old palace secret came tumbling out with the books and the spilled wax. The prince had loved Lady Jiang. He had painted her in secret and kept the painting locked away for years. He had gone south and found a woman who wore her face and married her in a riverside village, almost certainly without fully understanding what he was reaching for. His love for Xiaoa, which the whole capital had found so romantic and pure, was now understood as something built on misdirected longing for a woman he had never been allowed to have. All his tenderness for Xiaoa had likely been a reflection of his feelings for Lady Jiang, cast onto the wrong person. Prince Jingha's hand was in this revelation. The timing was too exact to be coincidence. The court erupted. Senior officials submitted urgent memorials calling the crown prince unfit to rule. They cited the hidden portrait as evidence of a man governed by private obsession rather than public duty. The chorus calling for his deposal was loud and seemingly unanimous, and for several days it seemed as though the outcome was inevitable. Then General Ku Tianming returned to the capital. He was the Empress's elder brother and the head of the empire's most powerful military family. He commanded the largest standing force loyal to the imperial household, and he walked into the throne room with the unhurried confidence of a man who has never been successfully challenged in his life and does not expect to start now. He spoke in the crown prince's defense with the calm of someone who considers the whole affair an overreaction by people with too much time on their hands. He called the memorial writers alarmists. He had the emperor's ear and he used it without hesitation. The noise died down. The crown prince remained in place. The court watched and waited to see what would come next. Prince Jingha came to my estate. He arrived on a grey afternoon that had been threatening rain since morning without delivering it. He sat across from me in the main hall with his hands around a cup of tea he did not drink, and he said General Ku Tianming was the obstacle neither of them had fully calculated. As long as the general's influence held, the crown prince could survive almost anything the court threw at him. His voice carried the edge of a man who has come very close to what he wants and finds an unexpected wall between himself and it. I looked at him steadily and told him that General Ku Tianming's position was built on a lie, and that the lie had a witness. He went very still. I told him about Qingshan Pass. My father and brother had not simply died in battle. They had died because General Ku Tianming had deliberately withheld his relief force. My father's army had engaged an enemy 3 times their size, grinding them down through days of brutal and exhausting fighting, holding the pass on the promise that reinforcements were on their way. My father sent a messenger to beg the general to move his troops forward. The general refused to advance. He ordered the messenger executed. He waited, patiently and deliberately, while House Wei's forces and the enemy bled each other to the point of collapse. Then he marched in with his fresh troops, scattered the weakened survivors, and claimed a great and celebrated victory. My father and brother had won that battle for him. They had given their lives for his glory. And he had put their names on a monument and collected all the honor for himself. My grudge against the crown prince had never been only about a broken engagement. Underneath everything, it was a blood debt with his mother's family, one that had been waiting more than a decade for a moment when it could finally be paid. I told Prince Jingha I had a letter, written in General Ku Tianming's own hand, bearing his personal seal, ordering the governor of a nearby city to seal the roads and prevent any aid from reaching Qingshan Pass. The general had not only held his own troops back. He had deliberately cut off every other possible source of help, surrounding my family's army with silence on every side. I had found the letter through my father's former subordinate, the man who had written to me when my engagement was first announced. He had served under my father and survived the battle by chance. He had kept the letter hidden for 14 years, knowing what it proved and knowing what would happen to him if the general ever found out he had it. There was also a witness. The lieutenant my father had sent to plead for reinforcements. The general had ordered this man executed. He had fought his way free, fallen from a cliff into the river below, and survived by a margin that he himself considered miraculous. He had spent 14 years in a northern province under a different name, living quietly, waiting for a morning when the truth might actually mean something and not simply get him killed all over again. I had found him 6 months ago, shortly after my engagement to the crown prince was announced, and I had begun to understand the full shape of the power sitting behind the imperial throne. Prince Jingha was silent for a long time after I finished. Then he said, very quietly, that I had been planning this since before any of the current conflict had even begun. I told him my father and brother deserved justice. That I had always been going to come for it. That this was simply the moment when pursuing it also served a larger purpose, and I saw no reason not to let one cause serve another. He looked at me with something I had not seen on his face in any of our previous encounters. Genuine and unguarded respect. The ferocity that had been in his voice when he spoke of removing the general was now directed outward with new precision. We were alike, he and I. We both kept long accounts and waited for the right moment to settle them. I told him I had one condition. When this was over and the court had resettled under new hands, I wanted one thing in return. I would name it at the right moment. He agreed without argument. My grandmother and I arrived at the palace gates at dawn, before the morning court session had properly begun. We knelt on the cold stones outside and I held up a written accusation sealed with the Wei family mark. I raised my voice into the pale morning air and I named General Ku Tianming's crimes one by one. The deliberate delay of reinforcements at Qingshan Pass. The orders to seal the roads. The execution order for my father's messenger. The embezzlement of military funds across 3 campaigns. His son's violent seizure of farmland in the northern provinces and the deaths of those who had tried to resist. I named every crime. I named every victim. I kept my voice from breaking because my father and brother had never broken, and I would not break here, not on the morning when it finally mattered most. Citizens gathered outside the palace gates as I spoke. The crowd grew steadily with every passing minute, drawn by the sound of a woman's voice naming powerful people on the steps of the palace itself. Word reached the throne room within the hour. The Emperor's personal attendant came to the gate and led us inside. I knelt on the stone floor of the Hall of Supreme Harmony with the entire court watching from both sides. General Ku Tianming stood 20 feet away, radiating fury edged with contempt. He called me a slanderer. A grief-blinded girl fabricating stories out of old pain. He spoke with the certainty of a man who has never been successfully challenged in his life and genuinely cannot believe this is actually happening. I told the Emperor I had a witness. The lieutenant walked in. He was older now, his hair more grey than black, his face carved by years of living carefully in someone else's shadow. He knelt and he spoke, and his voice did not waver once through the entire account. He described the general's encampment. The deliberate order to stand down. The moment he understood with absolute clarity that the reinforcements would never come. The execution order. The fall into the river. The 14 years of silence and waiting for a morning exactly like this one, when the truth could finally be spoken in a room where it would be heard. Then I presented the letter. The Emperor read it. The court watched his face change in real time, the careful imperial composure giving way to something colder and harder underneath. General Ku Tianming's composure came apart at the edges. What came through underneath was ugly and cornered and finished. The order came without hesitation. Guards. Seize him. The general was taken from the hall. His sons were arrested at their residences before nightfall. The soldiers who had served under him, finding themselves suddenly without a commander and acutely aware of which way the wind was now blowing, stood aside and let it all happen without resistance. My grandmother and I knelt together in the Wei family shrine that evening. I placed incense before my father's and brother's memorial tablets and I spoke to them. I told them it was done. I told them they could rest now. I pressed my forehead to the cold floor and wept without any strategy or calculation behind it. Just grief. Old grief that had been waiting patiently for permission to finally exhale. When I walked out of the shrine, I felt a lightness I had not known in years. The weight that had been sitting behind my ribs since the day the news came from Qingshan Pass was gone. The trials were swift. The evidence was irrefutable and the witnesses were credible, and several of the general's own subordinates, seeing clearly which way things were going, chose to speak rather than be buried alongside him. House Ku was convicted on every count. The sentences were carried out. The crown prince, stripped of his greatest protection, stood alone in a court that had spent months accumulating reasons to be finished with him. The senior officials who had kept quiet for years now found their voices all at once. The formal deposal proceedings began without much resistance. The Empress, who had spent decades maneuvering from the shadows and sacrificing people like counters on a board and believed herself beyond consequence, found that she was not. She was placed under house arrest in the deep quarters of the palace. A month later she chose her own ending, which was the last decision she made entirely on her own terms. The crown prince was formally stripped of his title and exiled to a remote estate in the northern hills. The decree named his failings plainly, in language that would be read aloud in public squares across the empire. Disorder in his household. disregard for the dignity of loyal subjects, conduct unbecoming of a future ruler. He had been a man of no great talent, made crown prince only by birthright, and never truly worthy of the title. There was a fire at the northern estate some months later. It burned through the night, visible for miles in every direction. When the smoke cleared, there was very little left of the buildings. Most people assumed the deposed prince had perished in it. No one investigated very hard. Empress Jingha was crowned in a ceremony that filled the capital with drums and silk banners and the smell of incense on the air for 3 full days. He was everything the court needed at that moment. Calm and precise and thoroughly prepared, as though he had been ready for this his entire life. Which of course he had. He summoned me to the palace after the coronation ceremonies were complete. He was seated on the throne, which looked entirely different with the right person in it. He had the same considering expression I remembered from that first afternoon in the unmarked residence outside the city, except now it was the expression of a man who had reached the destination he had been traveling toward his entire life, and who was genuinely curious about what the person who had helped him get there was going to ask for in return. He offered me the position of Empress. I declined. He offered me senior imperial consort, a rank just below Empress, with all the influence and protection that title carried. I declined that too. He was quiet for a moment, looking at me with something between amusement and genuine puzzlement. He said he had offered me the 2 highest positions available to any woman in the empire. He asked what else there could possibly be. I knelt. I asked him to do something that had not been done in centuries. I asked him to issue a decree allowing a woman to inherit her family's noble title. I asked him to name me, Wei Mingju, as the Marquess of House Wei in my own right, with all the land and standing and responsibility that title carried. He was silent for a long time. I told him that House Wei would not be remembered as the fading in-laws of the imperial family, diminished by its proximity to a power that had treated it as a convenient symbol and nothing more. I told him I wanted my house strong on its own terms, for another 100 years, built by its own hands and its own choices. I intended to find a man whose heart was entirely mine, one who would marry into House Wei and carry the name forward with me. Together we would rebuild what my father and brother had given their lives to protect. He listened to every word without interrupting. Then he asked me, quietly, why I had refused the position of Empress. He was honest. He said he could not promise to always trust me, could not promise to keep the palace empty and have eyes for only one woman. He would take consorts to balance the court and produce heirs to ensure the prosperity of the nation for generations to come. That was simply what a ruler had to do. It was the answer I expected. To be mother of the empire or the favored one of the emperor is the dream of most women, I replied, my own voice just as steady. But it is not my dream. Since I was a child I have carried the burden of restoring my house. I want House Wei to be strong and prosperous for 100 years, not to be known as the fading family of an imperial in-law. Your Majesty and I are alike. We are both ruthlessly pragmatic. A wise ruler and a loyal subject. That is the best relationship for us. A look of understanding moved across his face, followed by something I had not expected. Genuine admiration. He smiled faintly. I thought the throne of an empress was the highest honor a woman could aspire to. I see your ambitions are far greater than that. Your Majesty's ambition is the empire and you will achieve it, I said. My ambition is to fulfill my father and brother's legacy and bring lasting glory to my house. You will have your consorts to balance your court and continue your line. And I will find a young man whose heart is entirely mine, and he will marry into my house, and together we will rebuild House Wei. I may be a woman, but I will not be outdone by any man. He listened to all of it, a wistful look moving across his face that he did not bother to conceal. Very well, he said after a long pause. You have the same spirit my mother had in her youth. A pity her ambitions could not overcome the height of the palace walls. She would be glad to know you are free to soar in the wide world beyond them. Thank you for making this possible, Your Majesty. I will do everything in my power to serve you faithfully. I bowed deeply. From that day forward, we were emperor and subject. A clean and honest arrangement, with nothing hidden in it and no debt between us left unpaid. After leaving the palace, My carriage moved slowly through the southern market district. Suddenly I heard a voice at the base of a market stall, thin and frightened, asking for food. I drew back the curtain. A woman was crouched there in the dust, her hair loose and tangled, her clothes filthy, her hands extended toward the people passing by. She heard the carriage stop and looked up. Even through all the dirt and the hollowness that hunger puts in a face, I knew her immediately. Yun Xiaoa. She scrambled to her feet and tried to run. My guard stepped calmly into her path and she fell to her knees, her hands grabbing the hem of my robe, her voice coming out in broken pieces. She was sorry. She had not understood what she was walking into. She had been a fool used by people far cleverer than herself, pointed at a target she barely understood, and now the game was long over and everyone who had used her had moved on and she had been left with nothing at all. She had escaped the fire at the northern estate by pure chance, climbing out of a back window when the smell of smoke woke her in the night. She had been making her way south ever since, running out of money, running out of options. She did not want titles. She did not want palaces. She wanted to go home. She wanted the smell of osmanthus flowers along the river and a life that was small and ordinary and entirely hers. She just wanted to be a fisherman's daughter again, in the village where things had made sense. I looked down at her for a moment. The image of her stopping my carriage on that bright afternoon flashed through my mind. A lifetime ago, it felt like now. Then I gestured to my attendant, who placed a purse of silver coins on the ground beside her. Enough for the long journey south and a little more besides. Go home, I said. Don't come back to this city. She stared at the purse. Then she pressed her forehead to the ground and stayed there, her shoulders shaking with sobs she could not contain. When she finally looked up, the gratitude in her face was real and unperformed. I could see that clearly. All of that was in the past now. I returned to the carriage and did not look back. I arrived at the manor as the evening light was turning everything amber and soft. Lanterns were being lit along the front path. From the kitchen came the sound of the new maids singing, something cheerful and slightly out of tune, and the smell of soup and warm bread drifting through the open windows. The sound of a house that was alive again, genuinely and properly alive. My grandmother was in the main room, seated by the hearth with her prayer beads in her hands and a cup of tea at her elbow. She looked up when I came in and smiled in the way she very rarely allowed herself to smile, fully and without reservation, with nothing held back. I sat down beside her and we stayed there for a while without needing to speak, listening to the fire and the singing and the distant sounds of the city settling into evening outside our walls. On New Year's Eve, snow came down thick and soft, muffling all the edges of the world outside until everything felt very quiet and very close. My grandmother and I sat together at the table by the hearth with warm wine and sweet rice cakes between us, and we stayed up to watch the old year out together, the way we had done every year since the men of our house had stopped coming home to do it with us. The shadows have lifted from this house, my grandmother said softly, watching the fire. They have, I said. She raised her cup. From now on, may every year bring fortune. And may every year bring peace, I answered. We drank. The wine was warm and faintly sweet, and outside the first fireworks of the new year split the dark sky open with light and color and noise, chasing every last cold and heavy thing out of the night and into the past where it belonged. House Wei was no longer fading. It was only beginning. If this story stayed with you, you know exactly what to do. Like this video, share it with someone who loves a woman who plays the long game and wins it cleanly, and subscribe to Lotus Tale Studios so you never miss a story. Every single subscriber helps us keep these tales alive, and we have so many more coming. We will see you in the next one.